Okay, please state for us your full name and your current position.
My name is Barbara Milano Keenan, and I'm now a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to begin by finding out a little bit about you. Now, I know that you're a little mum about your personal life, but I want to ask you a little bit about your family background, your parents, where they came from, and your grandparents and where they came from, and what really helped to make you who you are.
Okay. Well, I'm very proud of my family. Very proud of my parents, my grandparents. My grandparents, none of them ever went to a day of school in their life. And they all came from Europe between 1908 and 1918. And
where from
Europe? Two from Italy, and my father's parents from Italy, and my mom's parents from what's now Austro-Hungary, which was Austro-Hungary, now Croatia. And my mom's mother was very atypical in that she preceded her husband to America. A lot of family situations, I think, including my father's parents, the man came first and then sent for the wife and some remaining younger children who might be still back at home. But my grandmother was on my mom's side, and I was named after her. And she was a very, very strong person, and her husband's family had some sick members and they couldn't leave. They already had their tickets to come to America, and so they decided that she would come on her own. And then World War I broke out. And so they were separated for 4 years, and she established herself in this country on her own. And so I'm particularly proud to be named after her. And my parents were raised in a small coal mining area outside Morgantown, West Virginia. And my dad didn't even speak English until, for several years, until it was time to go to school. That's how concentrated the ethnicities, the ethnic groups were. All the Italians lived together. My mom, most of the people were Russian and Slavic descent in her area. And so it was a kind of a very different life from the life that I grew up, which was a suburban child of an Army officer. So.
Well, let me back up for a minute and ask you, what was your mother's maiden name?
Her name was Barbara Turco.
And what motivated that side of your family to come to the United States?
It was poverty. I mean, they were all very poor. And on both sides, they had relatives who had already come. And they knew, they knew that there was opportunity in this country, and they were very hardworking on both sides, and also very smart. You know, I think that sometimes people falsely equate formal education with intelligence, and there's no correlation there, and there certainly wasn't in their case.
So give me all of their names. So your mother's name was Barbara.
Yes, and my mother's father was Paul Pozega, P-O-Z-E-G-A. My grandfather on my dad's side was Dominic Milano, and his wife was Maria Milano.
Now tell me how and why they came to the United States.
Same reason, opportunity. They were, my grandfather was a stonemason, my father's father, and he had some relatives already in this country, and it was an opportunity for them to get ahead in the world. Nothing was going to happen in the little town where they lived. He knew he would just be doing the same thing for the rest of his life.
So how did your parents meet?
They met in high school, but they weren't high school sweethearts or anything. They just knew each other. They both went to University High School in West Virginia, which was in Morgantown, which was really an unusual place because during the Depression and the era of the New Deal, Eleanor Roosevelt took an interest in that area of West Virginia, and particularly in the Arthurdale area. She was known for the Arthurdale community and supporting people in these coal mining hollows. And she came to visit their high school and they were involved in a program together, I guess. And my father was a year ahead of my mother, and he was the class president, so he actually escorted the president's wife. And that, I think, was one of the first memories, at least that they had, of knowing each other, getting ready for this visit of the First Lady.
That's an amazing story. Were there photographs taken by your family members at this event?
No, I think it was just such a different life. In fact, I didn't really have any sense of just how different until last, I guess it was October. My mom died last August, and she had always told us that she didn't want us to go back to the little coal mining hollow where she grew up. And she didn't want us to see the extreme poverty. And so I didn't. But then a couple months after she passed, I just decided it was important, and I was going to be at West Virginia University for court duties, and so I decided to go, and it was breathtaking. I mean, it was so sad. And so, when I saw that, I could see how they wouldn't even think of a camera. They wouldn't, I'm sure they didn't own one. They didn't own anything except their belief in the future.
So tell me your parents' names.
My mom was Ann Pizzega Milano, and my dad, James Vincent Milano.
And tell me when they were born and how many children were in their families.
Okay. My dad was born they were both born in 1919, and they were both born in Monongalia County, West Virginia. And my dad had two siblings, one of whom died when he was an infant. And my mom was an only child.
And so you know that your parents met sometime in high school. When did they start dating, and when did they get married?
Well, they started dating in college, and one of the main reasons was that they were some of the best customers of the main library at the West Virginia University. My mom didn't have any electricity in her house, so studying was a real challenge for her, and so she stayed and studied at the library. And my dad was a janitor. He made money putting himself through school as a janitor, and so I guess he hung around the library. I was never quite clear on that. But, and he also worked in the chemistry lab, so he was on campus working a lot, and she was studying a lot, and she also had a job working for the Dean of Women there. So I think there were students in that era who knew each other as people who were sort of on scholarship, getting a helping hand, and they came to kind of reconnect as students there, but mainly through the library. And so that was always a big part of their memory of the school, and that's actually something that I'm proud to say that they did before they passed away. They contributed money to the university to have a renovation of this part of the library where they met, or reconnected.
Well, it's interesting that both of them coming from very poor areas, both of them were able to go to college in the first place. Did they ever tell you how they were able to do that?
Well, they said it was so fortunate that they lived near the flagship university of their state. I mean, my mom lived in this coal mining hollow was, as I said, a very depressed place, but it was 7 miles from West Virginia University. And she started by walking to school. And a professor, Professor Clore, biology professor, stopped one day and said, I'm driving this road every day. Would you like a ride? And so he and his wife gave my mom a ride every day. And so that's how she got to. And my father he was closer. He was about 2 miles from the university. And so I'm not sure if he, took a bus or what. But his mother was absolutely determined that he would go to college. My grandmother, really the mothers were the strong educational drivers in the family. I guess the fathers were busy working. They were both coal miners. And so their mothers, they said that it was just never a question. They were going to go to college.
Did you all grow up in an environment in which you were afraid that your fathers would die in the coal mines?
Grandfathers?
Excuse me, grandfather.
Well, my grandfather, one did die. My grandfather, Paul Pizega, died in Purse Glove in big mine cave-in there. And that totally affected, obviously, my grandmother and my mom. I wasn't born yet, but you know, it just devastated them, and it changed what little security they had. I think the mine paid to bury him, and they might have given my grandmother a few $100s, and that was it. She was essentially on her own. So she took in coal miners. She had a house where she essentially gave room and board to people, and I think she rented the house. She didn't own the house, but she turned her house into a boarding house for coal miners and supported herself and my mom that way.
How old was your mom when her father passed?
She was in college.
And so this was perhaps part of the way that your grandmother perceived her world, that it was tied in with some of the tragedy of losing her husband, and then the poverty as well, and maybe that was part of the motivator for encouraging your mom to get a college education and to get out of that world? Or did she ever talk to you about that?
Well, my grandmother fortunately lived with us from when we came back from Austria. I was born in Vienna, Austria, when my dad was in the Army, and we came back to Fort Lee, Virginia when I was 4 months old. And my grandmother lived with us ever since, until she died when I was almost 15. So I got to hear a lot of stories from her. And she just said that there was no question. And of course, that my mom would go to school, go to college. And my father, you know, used to say to me, he said, you know, don't, as he put it, don't kid yourself, your grandmother's the smartest person in this house. You know, he said, I don't care who goes to school for how long, nobody's smarter than your nunny. And you know, she just had a lot of intelligence, and she just knew very quickly that that was the way for her daughter to prosper in this country.
What is your favorite memory of something that your grandmother told you growing up?
Well, one of the most distinct memories she told me, I remember we were sitting watching Alan Shepard go up in space. So when was that, 1961 maybe? Or?
Yes.
I'm thinking. So I was 11 years old. And she was telling me about when she was growing up, herding sheep, tending sheep in the old country, and how when they first saw an airplane, how they all got down on their knees. They thought it was the second coming of Christ. They saw a cross in the sky. And I remember as an 11-year-old thinking, my grandmother thought the world had come to an end when she saw an airplane in the sky, and she's sitting here with me watching a man go up in space. And I thought, this is really pretty unbelievable. I mean, I don't know that I thought much more than that, but I knew that it was significant that in a fairly brief time span that the world had changed so dramatically.
That is very interesting. Well, let me get back to your parents. What year did they get married?
1945, right after the war. My dad was in World War II for the entire time, and he shipped out to North Africa in 1942. So he was part of the group that landed in North Africa then and went up into Italy and from there on. So he did not get out of the service until 1945 in the spring. And so they got married when he got home.
Did he ever tell you any of the stories of his experiences in war?
Yes and no. He really wasn't a talker about that. And it's funny because he was a talker in so many other ways. I mean, he loved a good story, but he didn't spend too much time. He was with an intelligence unit. They interrogated prisoners. He did tell me about some of the remarkable people he worked with. In fact, he told me one story that has stuck with me over the years about in North Africa when there was some sort of big action coming, in terms of the British and the whole Allied forces. There was going to be a big encounter with the Germans, and everybody was so afraid in their unit. And he was the only person with a bachelor's degree in his unit. The Army had compiled all these people who were extraordinarily gifted and intelligent in their fields. They had all these German speakers, Italian speakers, and my dad was actually in that unit because he was a native Italian speaker from their perspective. And and so these were people who had been professors at Princeton, one was at Emory, a really remarkable group of people. And I said, Dad, what was it like with these 40-year-old men, 35, 40-year-old guys who weren't really soldiers? They were serving their country and very impressively, but they weren't born soldiers. And he said, well, we got out a copy. One of the professors, I think his name was Coleman Norton at Princeton, had a copy of King Lear. And he said, so with the noise in the background, we got out the copy of King Lear and we took the different parts and we read the play, and then that stuck with me. That here these men, that's how they coped with the terror that they were facing, and the certainty that, that a lot of people were going to be dying the next day. Probably not their group, but people they knew and had worked with, and that's how they dealt with it.
Did you ever ask him the irony of them reading King Lear at that point?
Well, no, not specifically. I hadn't, now that I think about it, that would have been a wonderful question to ask. But no, I guess it was because that's what the professor had, and I didn't think enough to ask him, I'm sorry to say.
No, this is me looking back on that situation.
It's fascinating. I should have thought of it.
So now, how long were your parents married before they started having children?
Not long. My sister Mary was born 2 years later in 1947. And my mom came over to Austria. My dad came home to West Virginia and started teaching as a chemistry teacher. And he said, Friday nights we went to the sheriff's office and played cards. And he said, I kind of thought, oh, gee, I'm going to be doing this the rest of my life. He said, I just got this picture that the rest of my life, it'll be Friday night at the sheriff's office. So he actually decided to go back into the Army and make it his career. At that point in time, he had his chemistry degree from West Virginia University, but no particular career goal, other than probably to teach. And so the Army sent him to Austria, where he was working with the British and some other, actually Vienna at that time was divided by the Allies into the 4 different zones. And so they were working with, the British, the French, the Russians, and doing a lot of intelligence in the post-war era, interrogating people, trying to make decisions, strategic decisions on who was important in the lineup, just trying to reorder the universe that had been totally, broken up by the war. So he was brought to Austria in 46, and my mom came over, and my sister was born the end of 47, and then I was born in 1950. So.
And at what point did your family move back to the United States?
Well, I was only 4 months old, and we moved back to Fort Lee. And then the Army sent my dad to Fort Bragg after that, and then to the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania to get a business degree. And so I was 4 when we went to Pennsylvania.
And why did they send him there to get a business degree?
Well, I guess, I'm a proud daughter, so I guess they figured he was a smart guy, and there was a lot of opportunity in the Army in those days. And it was a place where somebody could get ahead, who was a worker, and he was a tremendous worker. I mean, he was always doing something, and my parents were both very education oriented, and not just that, they were always busy doing things, and I think, and he was just a very, very hard worker, and they picked, I think, 3 or 4 people a year out of the Army to send to the Wharton School, and he was one of them.
Did your grandmother accompany you all?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, she was part of the group. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Let me ask you, what was it like growing up in your household? What kinds of things did your parents encourage you to do? What kinds of things did you and your sister do?
Well, the parents, it was always about reading with my parents, and my grandmother too. We went to the library twice a week, and my mom would bring a grocery bag from the grocery store, and she'd say, you can fill up this bag, but you can't, no more. That's all I'm gonna let, and then she would, as we would fill up the bag at the checkout, she would write down the titles so that she wouldn't lose them. She'd know all the books we had to take back in a few days. And that was mainly the summer when we would read like that. During the school year, it was much more studying, studying our school books, but it was always about reading and learning by reading, limiting television. I think we got to watch maybe an hour a day in the summer. That was when it was really, easy. And then during the school year, it was only for special things. We got to watch Ed Sullivan on Sunday night, but other than that, we weren't allowed.
And do you think that really helped to frame the way that you live your life today?
Well, it made me a reader for life. It definitely did, yeah.
Well, what was your favorite genre of books in those earlier years?
Oh boy, well, when I was growing up, we started with, the books about animals, and, I remember Black Beauty and Frisky the Goat, and, and The Little Engine That Could. I loved that book. Oh my gosh, I was just, I couldn't stop reading that. My mother kept, at one point said, we're not going to, check out The Little Engine That Could again. You know what that says. But, and that was sort of a fault of mine. I liked checking out my old favorites, and she kept pushing me, you got to do something new. And, but and then I got into the Nancy Drew books, and then I went through the nurse phase where I liked Cherry Ames, and, Cherry Ames Student Nurse and Army Nurse, and the Sue Barton books. She was a nurse as well. And there weren't any women doctor books then, but my mom made sure that we read the what we called the blue biographies. I don't know if you remember those. You're probably too young. The biographies you'd get out of the public library that had a bright blue cover, and they had like a little swirl that was like a cloud, and it would say, Maria Mitchell, girl astronomer, Marie Curie, girl doctor, or whatever it was. And it was, of course, gender specific in the fact that it, highlighted the fact they were girls or boys. But we read every blue biography there was. George Washington Carver, professor and farmer, or, boy farmer, or whatever it was called. But we read them all, and we loved those too.
Did you and your sister seem to have a competition as to who could read the book the fastest?
Well, my sister Mary is 2 years older than I am, and she was always the doobie of the family. She obeyed all the rules. She never did anything wrong. The nuns loved her. I never really got in big trouble because I knew I didn't want to bring that home. I did not want the colonel to ever have to discipline me. But but I did talk in class. I'd tell the teachers that I thought the Pope was, hoarding art treasures while there were people starving in the world, and things that didn't really make me the most popular student in Catholic school from the teacher's perspective. But but my sister Mary was perfect. So the nuns used to always say, "Why aren't you more like your sister?" Which probably made me want to be less like my sister. But I successfully stayed out of any serious trouble. Conduct was my big problem. I usually got D's in conduct, but for talking, I never did anything really other than talk. And I'm not sure. Oh, I skipped school a couple days in grade school, but I think that was about as bad as I ever got. But then my younger sister, Katie, who's 3.5 years younger, there was enough of a distance between us in age that she kind of looked up to me, and we weren't competitive at all. And I was more like her, I don't know, maybe, I don't want to say a role model, but I was somebody that she wanted to hang out with and she felt lucky to be with. So we always got along great. And then my brother, who's 7 years younger, I was more like a really big sister to him. It wasn't like being an aunt or anything, but there was definitely a distance. But I was very, very proud that I had a brother. I still love him very much, and my sisters too. I mean, we were very fortunate to have parents who loved us and, just gave us everything they had.
Well, now you mentioned something about a statement that you made to the nuns saying that the Pope was hoarding gold or whatever wealth and not feeding the poor. And that raises a question about what you were reading and the questions that you were asking about your world. And at what point did you find yourself really becoming more inquisitive about finding out more about what was going on as opposed to staying in the world of fiction?
Well, my grandfather, Dominic Milano, who I was very, very fortunate to know until he died when I was 40. So I really got to know him. And when I was about 30, he introduced me to the concept of him being an atheist. And, I'd had this Catholic education, and I'm still, very much a believer. But Grandpa, taught me that, not everybody thinks that way. And he explained to me how when he was growing up and he was an altar boy and, the priests used to, drink wine on the side and, use the parishioners' hard-earned money to essentially live a fat cat life, or this was his perspective. But he was also a very involved in the United Mine Workers. He was a Wobbly before that, International Workers of the World. He was a quasi-Marxist. He, kind of referred to himself as a Marxist. He thought Ronald Reagan was the devil, and that's his words, not mine. So he had, I think he was probably the person who led me most to be a questioner and maybe to, doubt the status quo. Is this the best thing? Is this going right? Can this be changed? I probably have to give him credit for planting the seed.
Are you the only sibling in your family who you would perhaps see as the main questioner?
Oh, no, not at all. Well, my older sister, Mary, she has been a lifelong teacher, high school teacher, and most recently at Thomas Jefferson High School, which is the magnet high school in Northern Virginia. And she's spent most of her career teaching English to very gifted science students. So that's been a very rewarding career for her, I know. But she, I don't want to say but, and that wasn't really part of her role, I don't think, as teaching children to love literature, children who were destined to become rocket scientists. The challenge was to, make them love literature. And many of them were drawn to it naturally anyway. I don't mean to suggest they weren't. But so she never became the doubter questioner. My younger sister did. My younger sister went the business route. And Katie, also went to Cornell the way I don't say as I did, and then she went to University of Chicago Business School, and she worked her way up in the business world and in advertising, and then most recently retired as a vice president of AOL. And so she saw a very rough and tumble business world for women, in particular, rising up the corporate ladder, and so she definitely became a questioner and a challenger of authority too. So I'd say we were the two. And then my brother Jim, he became a CPA and a tax lawyer. So he was more interested in order and definition. And so we all used our education in different ways.
Well, that leads me to my next question, and that is about your grade school and high school training. The schools that you went to were Catholic schools. So could you tell us what the names of those schools, and whether there were any teachers in those schools who really impacted your life?
Well, actually, one big thing that impacted my life was when I was in kindergarten at St. James, and the kindergarten teacher called my parents and said, "I don't think your daughter should go to first grade." She said she can read, she can write. And this was mainly because my grandmother had taught my sister and I. After school, we would sit at the dining room table, and it was like a little study hall, and I got to play basketball after I did, my work. And so I knew, I guess, a lot more than, now kids today are so smart, so advanced when they're 5. I probably wasn't even close. But, for that day and age when children weren't, particularly given a lot of resources, my grandmother was just like our private tutor. And so the teachers called my parents and said, I think she should go to second grade, which was good and bad. I was always different. The teachers made a point, I remember in my early years, that I hadn't been to first grade, so I probably wouldn't know things the other kids knew. And so I always felt a little different being younger. But I got over that. It took maybe a year or two before, I just knew I was always going to be younger than everybody, and, kind of forgot about it. But that was a distinct memory from elementary school. And then I loved playing basketball. And my dad, when I was in 4th grade, he cut out a big piece of plywood and built me a hoop at the end of the driveway, and I would practice religiously every day. And so I played on the basketball team, and I loved sports. Baseball was just, and I love baseball still, but my dad and I watched baseball together. My grandmother and I watched baseball. She and I also would watch the Washington Senators reruns. Now, they were one of the worst teams in baseball. They were like the Miami Marlins today, or even worse. And my grandmother and I would watch the reruns in the winter. And, we were just pathetic fans. We loved them. I don't know why I thought they would win, when they were playing on a videotape, but I did. And of course they didn't win, but and we were dying for spring training every year, and so sports was a big part of my life growing up. I wasn't good at anything. I was probably a B at best, at anything, but I just loved it so much. I think that I probably was accepted with much more talented people to play on sports teams. I played softball, I just loved anything. I loved to play with the boys. Absolutely loved that, because they were always stronger. So I was very competitive about, in the backyard, being able to hit as hard as they did, stuff like that.
Were you the primary sibling who loved sports perhaps, or was involved in sports more than anyone else?
Yes, definitely. And I don't know why. I really don't. I just became fascinated by baseball, and I think part of it was when my dad went to Cambodia. He was on a tour of duty for a year with the military, and so part of my job the year he was gone was to send him the box scores every day from the Washington Senators. And I think that really gave me a love of the game and an understanding, because I had to write to him. We wrote him letters every day. My mom had us write every day to him. And I usually just explained to him that Harmon Killebrew was doing great, or whoever the player was that I was focusing on at the time. And so I think that's why I became a sports fan. And I really don't know why the others didn't. Even my brother, nobody was the way I was.
How old were you at that time?
Oh, I was 8 when my dad went overseas. So I guess it was a really formative time.
Did you find yourself playing other kinds of games, the traditional games that girls play, such as hopscotch?
Oh yeah, hopscotch and jacks. I mean, we were jacks maniacs. My sister Mary, older sister, was so good that the kids wouldn't play with her. They ostracized her because she always won. So I remember saying, Mary, you got to just blow it a few times, and then they'll let you play with you. They'll let you play with them. And so she did, and they let her play with them. But she was the jacks player. And again, I was a B player. I wasn't really that good at anything. I just loved it. So.
Well, you say that, but then you continued to play. So you had to have gotten better after a while.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was always a B. And that's one of the things, that if I could ever, someone would, say, sprinkle fairy dust on me and be different, I'd be really good at some athletic endeavor. I would love to have been able to do that.
So you say you were a B, but you continued to play.
Oh, sure, because it was fun. Yeah.
And what was fun about it?
Well, I loved, the team, doing things, working hard. I loved the excitement of winning. I just enjoyed it.
And what about your relationship with the other players?
Oh, got along fine. I was never the star, but I was solid. I was somebody they could count on, but never even close to being a star.
So tell me what the name of the high school was that you graduated from.
Bishop Dennis J. O'Connell High School in Arlington.
And what year did you graduate?
1967.
And did you have any teachers in high school who particularly impacted your future career or the way that you approached different subjects?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And in my freshman year in high school, probably the most significant thing that happened to me was getting in trouble. Again, for, voicing my opinion on something. If it wasn't the Pope, it was something else, related, some, a counter-authority measure on my part. And the nun came up to me and she said, and I can't remember her name, and I'm very sorry that I can't right now. It escapes me. But she came up to me and she said, Miss Milano, you've got a choice. You can be in detention for the rest of the year, or you can join the debate team. She said, you've always got something to say. Do you want to put it to some good use? Just like that. And I thought debate team's got to be better than doing long division, no calculators in those days, and doing long division every day until the bus came. So I signed up for the debate team, and that really changed, I don't say dramatically, it changed my whole life, but it really oriented my life to, I love debate. In fact, basketball gave way to debate. My friends and I, we traveled all over the East Coast representing our high school debating. We went to the national finals a couple times. We had a great time. And we were, debating whether nuclear weapons should be abolished. We were debating compulsory arbitration in basic industries in the United States labor market. Foreign assistance, should the United States eliminate military assistance and concentrate only on economic assistance to foreign countries. So they were pretty sophisticated subjects for high school students, and we studied hard and loved it.
Do you think this experience with the debate team helped to encourage even more concentration in your regular studies?
Not really. I mean, I did what I needed to do. I wasn't a natural student. I was a natural reader. I was a total nerd. In Fairfax, they had this thing called the homework hour, where if students couldn't solve a math problem, they would call the homework hour, and then other kids would call in with the answers. And I was the nerd who called in with the answers sometimes. I mean, I was a loser in terms of social, But I did all these, but I had fun. And I had a lot of boys who were friends. I had no boyfriends, and it was probably a very good thing because I concentrated on developing myself as a person without worrying about, I knew I didn't think I was ever going to be cute. I sort of said, well, that's sort of for other people. So I'm going to be good at sports, I'm going to be smart, and I'm going to, have a good time. And I knew I'd never be a cheerleader.
Well, going back to that question, but that comment that you made about you didn't have any boyfriends. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit more about that, about how you viewed yourself and how you viewed your relationship with boys versus girls.
Well, probably all girls when they're 14 feel uncute, not cute. I was particularly not cute. I mean, I had black glasses, I had braces, some of the kids, when they would tease me, in a nice way, would call me Brillo because I had frizzy hair. I was hugely unattractive. And so my picture of myself was, I'm never going to be a cheerleader. I'm never going to be somebody, I'm not going to be one of those girls. So I'm going to be somebody else. And so actually physical appearance, when I think about it, was sort of a defining thing for me because I knew I had to stand out some other way.
Did you find that you had more in common with some of the boys, especially those who were on the debate teams?
Well, we were very gender segregated at Bishop O'Connell. The boys and girls only got to talk, we were separated completely in terms of the school day. And then in terms, and we got to talk for 15 minutes after we ate our lunches, okay? The girls could eat with only girls, but afterwards you could go out in this patio area and you could talk to the boys. But, nobody knew any boys, and so there were maybe 5 cute girls, who talked to their boyfriends, and the rest of us just kind of stood around. So I never really got to know very many boys until we went on the debate circuit. And then we got to meet boys from other schools. And I met a lot of boys and girls who ended up being some pretty extraordinary people. One boy who I met and did go out with a couple times in college, but we stayed friends, he's now the Chancellor of the University of London. I mean, he went on and became a Rhodes Scholar and stayed in England, and there were just a lot of people. One of the debaters became a doctor in New Hampshire. They were all kids who were, interested in the future. And so, yes, I did get to, I felt a little bit more kind of accepted once, when you debated somebody and you were, you got to know them, and, we'd sit around and eat lunch and we'd wait for our next round, and so we'd talk to the other kids, and so we got to know them.
Well, now, your involvement with the debate team helped to hone these skills that would later become important. Was the teacher who suggested or gave you the ultimatum of detention or the debate team, was that teacher the sponsor of the debate team?
She was not. The sponsor of the debate team was a teacher named Miss Shanley, Nancy Shanley, and she was what they call in Catholic school a lay teacher. She was not a nun. And we girls idolized Miss Shanley. Miss Shanley was probably, I think, 27 or 28. She lived in Georgetown, and she was very cool. I mean, she was pretty, and we dreamed up this romantic past that her boyfriend had left her to become a priest. I don't know if that was true, but, we believed it. It was the culture. Somebody either made up the story or discovered it. But anyway, Miss Shanley was our debate teacher. She took us to see the Beatles when they came to America in 1964. I mean, that's how cool she was. And just to watch them arrive at Union Station. We didn't, obviously we didn't have tickets or anything. But anyway, she was the teacher, and I idolized her just like all the other girls. And she had us go to her apartment in Georgetown, and we got to see, it was just really, it was like an exotic life, that our teacher was living. And so she encouraged us, and we would do we would march to the moon for her. And so she encouraged us and got us going, and was a very strong motivating force for me. And then some of the other nuns were. I mean, some of the nuns were too. I don't mean to take away from them. They were great educators. A lot of fear, you know, but I guess I needed that. One teacher, you know, I was talking in class in math, and it was I remember it was a Monday, because she said, "Miss Milano, you know everything, don't you?" And I said, "No, sister, I don't." And she said, "You know so much, you're going to be teaching the class." She said, "The whole week." Now, I knew I was a junior in high school, and I was taking advanced algebra or whatever it was, I don't remember. But I remember I had to teach that class the whole week, and I never talked in her class again, ever, ever.
What was that experience like?
Well, you know, it was funny, because at the end of the first day, she said, "Not bad." She said, "You can do better tomorrow." And we came in, and I taught again the next day, and you know, but she made a very powerful lesson to every girl in the class. Nobody ever talked in that class again. And so, you know, they were great educators. You know, there was, as I said, you know, you weren't encouraged to question, particularly not in the religious realm. I mean, and there was one nun who told me she thought I had a vocation, which struck terror in my heart. That was the last thing I wanted to do. You know, I respected them, you know, but as I said, I feared them, but I didn't want to join them. And there was a little bit of fear going on there. I mean, she said, if you turn your back on God, you'll never be happy. And so I just used to pray that I never have a vocation, and I think I prayed my way out of it. But.
Well, now, at what point did you decide you were going to college, and what kinds of colleges were you interested in attending?
Well, I knew I was going to college. I mean, I knew that when I was 8, you know, from my parents. And in terms of where I was going to go, my sister Mary went to a Catholic women's college, Manhattanville College, right outside New York City. The Sacred Heart nuns ran that. And so then the question was, would I go to Manhattanville? And I really didn't want to go there because I'd gone to an all-girls school, and I wanted to go to a big co-ed school. And University of Virginia in those days was not accepting women unless you wanted to be in the nursing school or the elementary education school. And so the girls, Virginia's girls, I don't want to say had to, but had to go to Mary Washington or could go to William and Mary. So I knew I would be applying to William and Mary because that was the best school in Virginia for a girl to go to, at least in my, from my perspective. And then I decided to apply to some Ivy League schools. My mom, my parents didn't have that much money, but my mom said, "You will go to whatever school, we'll find a way, you pick your school." And so I picked William and Mary and Radcliffe, Harvard, and Cornell, and University of Pennsylvania, because my dad had gone there to graduate school. And Radcliffe put me on the waiting list, which my dear mom, who was such a booster of me, when we got the letter, she said, "Oh, there's got to be a mistake. Let me call." I said, "Mom, don't, please." But that's how big a booster she was of me. But I got in the other schools, and I decided to go to Cornell. It was a big co-ed school. I didn't want to go to school with anybody I'd known. I wanted an adventure. I wanted something different, and I found it. It was a great place.
What made you want an adventure?
Well, I'd been to Catholic schools. I'd, walked the walk, but I don't want to say listen to the party line, but listen to the party line. And I was just ready to go out into the big world and see what was out there.
And so you went to Cornell. Were there any professors who really changed your life or changed your perspective? And what did you decide to major in?
Okay. Well, it was the one negative about my experience at Cornell. It was such a big school that you really didn't get to know the professors. And, again, putting on the list of maybe do differently, It was a great school, but I would have done it differently. If I had gone there, I would have made more of an effort to get to know professors. I really didn't know my professors. I had because we had teaching assistants, and they were great, and very talented people. And so I had a few seminars as a junior and senior, and with Richard Paulenberg, Professor Paulenberg, who ended up being a very distinguished, I think, well-known professor, Walter Lefebvre. I took a seminar with him in foreign policy. And so, but I worked my way into that. You had to kind of get your grades to a point where they would accept you into that really small seminar. But really, there wasn't a place for a one-on-one education with your professors at Cornell as an undergraduate when I was there. It may be different now.
And what was your major?
History.
And why did you choose that?
Oh, I loved it. I just loved it. Yeah, I think it was those blue biographies. I loved reading about people. I loved learning about, I was always fascinated, even in high school, about how we keep making the same mistakes, from generation to generation, from civilization to civilization. People are drawn to war, all these different calamities, that self-imposed calamities of the human condition. So it just drew me like a magnet. I didn't really have free choice in that respect, I guess, but I took other courses that I liked a lot. I mean, I took a lot of art history. I took computer science because I felt it was a kind of a cultural literacy thing back in the 60s, that if you didn't know something about it, you were going to be on the outs. I took, I took a lot of different things. Economics, I guess, geology was my science requirement. I took that with the football players and the hockey players, and we camped around the gorges around Ithaca, and we weren't very good students. I felt sorry for that professor. Nobody was interested in the subject. But most of my courses I loved, just loved.
Did you continue your passion in sports?
No, I didn't. I got involved in student government there at Cornell. And, you look back on these things, you think, why did I ever do this? But I was only there like 4 days, and they were looking for class officers for the freshman class. And the class, the undergraduate, the class had a lot of people in it. I don't remember how many, but it was, it was a big school. So I thought, there were these hundreds of people here, and a good way to get to know them is to run for office. So I ran, I did this corny thing in my room, the next door neighbor came up with, because of my very curly hair. I was Lucy, I guess it was, or one of the Peanuts characters had said, people always think more of you when you have naturally curly, they expect more of you when you have naturally curly hair. So I did a little campaign poster, the curly-haired candidate, and I became the vice president of the class. And, it just sounds so hokey to say it, but I really got interested in it. I got to meet, and I did get to meet some professors there, and different issues of, student governance and things like that. And that became a big issue when Cornell, when the African-American students took over the student union in 1969 at Cornell. And then we had a constituent assembly, it was called, with all the different university groups, and I was one of the student representatives. So that was, an important part of my college life.
Did that event change the way you thought of at least what was happening in your world? Because you're talking about a time when things are really changing pretty rapidly in terms of race relations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I lived in a very white neighborhood, went to a white school, completely white. Although in high school, we had one African-American boy, a young man in our class. And I don't know why we didn't have more. I wasn't attuned enough to figure that one out. But my dad being in the Army, we went to Fort Myer to swim. There were African Americans and whites, you know, we swam together, we did everything together, we ate together. So it wasn't an issue in our family life, our social life. My dad, one of his best friends from New York was African American, and you know, they would come to visit. Our neighbors, some of the neighbor children asked us why we had those people come visit. And I remember being very annoyed, you know, thinking that they were obnoxious. But, and then when I was in, also getting back to high school, I had one very significant race-related incident, or at least for me it was, awakening. I took the bus to come to Richmond for the debate finals for Virginia, and with my friends. And we went in the Greyhound bus station to a coffee shop to get a Coke. And the woman said, "I can't serve you." And I didn't have a clue as to what she was saying. She said, "You have to go over across the hall." And I said, "I just want a Coke." And we were running late. I said, "You know, would you please, you know, I've got the money, you know, could you get me this Coke?" She said, "You don't understand. I can't serve you. I'm sorry, you have to." She said, "It's against the law for me to give you a Coke." And then, you know, finally the light went on. She can't give me a Coke, sell me a Coke, because she's black and I'm white. And it just shocked the heck out of me. I don't know why you know, I never had that. We just didn't have that in our growing up, even though it was you know, the Fort Myer life, you didn't have that, and you didn't have that in our neighborhood because it was all white, and so it was really an eye-opener for me. And that was my, I guess, either junior year in high school. So that was my first really race-conscious moment, I think. And then in college, race consciousness, a friend of mine had come from Shreveport, Louisiana, and he had said he had never talked to a white person in his life. And I didn't believe it. I thought that was just, you know, kind of an attention-getting thing, or, you know, he was being dramatic. And he said, "No, I never talked to a white, there was no reason to talk to a white person." And that struck me just profoundly. And then, of course, so much was happening with civil rights. Martin Luther King was killed in my freshman year. That had a big impact. Some of my friends were, I had a lot of Jewish friends in college. Cornell had a lot of Jewish students. And I'm only saying that, for some reason, they seemed to be the more socially and politically progressive people in the university at the time. And one of my friends was very involved with the NAACP, which was, you know, very unusual for a white girl, I thought. But she was very, you know, always raising the issues of race. And when Martin Luther King died, I'll never forget, you know, I mean, we were all upset, obviously, but how absolutely broken she was. And then when Bobby Kennedy was shot, and we went to watch his railroad coffin go by as it was leaving New York City. It was just a terrible time. I mean, it was such a extraordinary time to come of age, you know, when you think about it, with the Vietnam War. I know every generation has its events, but, you know, having Kennedy shot when I was a freshman in high school, and then having Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy killed, they were very, very defining moments.
How do you think that really impacted the way that you would see your future?
Well, I felt like I knew the world was changing a lot, and that made me very excited. My grandfather, you know, of course, had been beating the drum for economic equality for a long time. My dad had actually worked in the coal mines in the summer to make more money, and he had worked with some black men, some African Americans. And so, and I use that word interchangeably. And sometimes, you know, I've talked with my dear friend Leroy Hassell, our former Chief Justice here, and he used to say, I use the word black And I say, Leroy, I have other friends who say African American. What should I say? And he said, say either, Barbara. So I have felt at liberty to say either. So if I'm going back and forth, that's why I am. But I never had any sense that I would be, particularly associated with the civil rights movement. But I was always very, very interested in it and very, very drawn to it. And of course with women's issues, I was coming of age in that time too. So a lot was happening. And of course, throughout all of it was my mom always telling me, you can do anything you want in life. And, when my dad, when I was sworn into the federal court 3+ years ago, I talked about my parents. And if it's okay if I just repeat what I said about them, because it encapsulates them for me. I said, my dad always taught me the importance of asking why, learning, questioning, learning again, learning more when you think you know it all. And my mom didn't teach me to ask why. She taught me to ask why not. She gave me the sense of belief in possibility. I could do anything. She believed I was wonderful. She believed I was exceptional. I wasn't by any manner of means. I was this, dorky little kid. But she gave me that sense that I was special. And, that's just an incalculable gift that a parent can give a child. And when I see young kids who don't have that gift, my heart goes out to them because it just makes such a difference.
Well, little wonder that you were drawn to the field of history, because those are the ideas that are encapsulated in that particular discipline. And I was wondering, what made you choose not to actually pursue history or some aspect of history as a career?
Actually, it was one of my advisor in college, Michael Keenan. Professor Keenan said, I told him I was thinking about history or thinking about law school. And he said, it's hard for me to advise anybody to go on in history now. Then there was such an overabundance of history students, and he said, you'll be getting a PhD and you'll have to start out probably in a junior college. And he said, maybe you'll be lucky and get to university. He said, but it's going to be a long road. And he said, you've got to think about that. And I thought, well, I'm the restless type, so I thought I probably should go to law school, but I'm going to love history my whole life, and I have.
And so then your next step was to apply to a law school. Mm-hmm. And what were the choices, and why were you making those particular choices for law school?
Well, the law school story is a drama in itself, like everything else. I applied to a number of law schools, and Cornell, in those days there was, and I don't know if it still is, it's called the Law School Data Assembly Service. It was a Princeton outfit that took the transcripts and your test scores and I guess put them into boilerplate format so all the law schools could review the candidates side by side. Well, Cornell never sent my transcript. I paid for the transcript, signed the forms, everything. The registrar's office never sent it to the Law School Data Assembly Service. So when all my friends were getting their acceptances, I remember I got, I guess the first letter was from University of Michigan. And they said, we're very sorry you never completed your application. Maybe you'll, think about us next year. And it was a very nice letter. But I thought, holy Toledo, what's going on? So I called them and they said, we never got your transcript. We never got the information from the Law School Data Assembly Service. And this was, I guess, April, when people were hearing. And so essentially it was too late. And I was just, just a little overachiever goober. I was destroyed. I mean, it was horrible. And so my dad, at that time, had gotten a PhD in business administration from George Washington University. And so he said, well, let me see if I can get you an interview with the law school. and he said, talk to the dean or something. And he didn't have any association with the dean or anything, but they agreed to talk with me. But they were very strict. They said, oh, you definitely would have been admitted, no question, but we have a waiting list and we have a commitment to people who essentially did what they were supposed to do. They said, but we'll put you in the night school. And when we have an opening, if somebody falls out of the day school, we'll let you go into the day school. It ended up being another great thing for me, because I went to school with people, started law school, with people who were making all sorts of sacrifices to go to school. There were doctors who were going to school at night because they were intrigued with the law. There were people who, one woman was a waitress, out of college going to law school. There are people, it was such a rich group of life experiences, people in their 40s, some of them. So it was fabulous. And then I did transfer into the day school at the end of the first semester, and went as a day student. But I got a job at the Justice Department because I really didn't want to just go to school. I wanted to kind of see law in action. So I had my interview at the Justice Department the day J. Edgar Hoover died. And the place was just a buzz, and it was, I could tell it was an exciting place, and I wanted to be there. So I had an interview. This is actually the end of my freshman year with the United States Marshals, the counsel to the United States Marshal Service under the Deputy Attorney General, then Richard Kleindienst. And he offered me a job, the Marshal's counsel, and I took that job. And so I was there in law school, at the Justice Department during Watergate, which was fascinating. And it was just such an interesting time to be a law student that the law school kind of became boring, actually. I loved, from my grandfather's background, I loved labor relations. And so with the Marshal Service, we were negotiating contracts with the marshals. So I traveled with my boss when I was in law school to Brooklyn, to Manhattan, to negotiate contracts. And my boss, he liked to go to, I shouldn't say this probably on camera, but he liked to go to plays and things like that in New York. So he would leave me as a 22, 23-year-old to work out these terms of these labor deals with these old, cigar-chomping marshals. And it was a great experience. And then, of course, I couldn't seal a deal. He had to come back and seal the deal. But I got to negotiate terms of contracts. And so law school was sort of, it was a necessity at that point. And my real stimulation was in my work. And, but I liked law school, but law school wasn't the big formative part of me being interested in the law. It was working at the Justice Department. What made you want to work at the Justice Department? Oh, I just thought it would be exciting. I went for that interview, and this was 1972, and it was just an exciting time to be in Washington. And I knew that there were a lot of issues and things going on, and then of course everything exploded the next summer, when John Dean testified. But you could have applied for a job at a law firm. Why at the Justice Department? Well, I've always been drawn to public service. That's always, it always impressed me that my dad got ahead in the military. We had a sense growing up, maybe being a little different, being Italian. People called us Italian. We were very American. We didn't think of ourselves as that, but people called us Italian. We always saw government service as a kind of a great equalizer, I think. Maybe that was part of it. I was also drawn to, I think the civil rights component of what justice had done and reading about it. So it was just a lot of little things, no great impelling force. But the idea of a law firm didn't really interest me. Now, you said that you were there during the Watergate scandal. Mm-hmm.
So what little nuggets did you hear about or were you involved in during that period?
Well, we were representing the marshals. So marshals from all over the country would call with questions of law, and then I would research them and recommend answers to my boss. So we really weren't involved in Watergate, except to the extent that, everybody in the building knew everything that was going on. And all the speculation, and it was exciting because there were other students from GW in Georgetown who were working there, Justice Department, jobs, and so we were sort of a group, and we were very just kind of addicted to what was going on. It was very interesting, and we knew that as lawyers, we were going to be part of this. So it was a very I keep using the word exciting, but it was a very exciting time.
Now, you said that when you would go up to New York, your boss would let you negotiate a lot of the contracts. What made him give you that kind of responsibility?
Well, he probably wanted to go see the plays, to be fair. And then he also knew that I wouldn't burn down the store while he was gone. I think he had a certain level of confidence in me that that I was hardworking, I was trustworthy, certainly trustworthy. And he knew that I would think and work and do what he said. So.
Did he ever change anything that you laid out?
Not usually, no, No, because I knew how he thought. I knew what he thought was important, and I knew what he thought could give and take, and so I had a pretty good idea of what we needed to do.
And so as a result of that, he was giving you a lot of responsibility. How did you feel?
Well, when I think about it now, it was crazy. I mean, it was absolutely crazy. I mean, because these marshals had been, they've been doing this forever. And even though you couldn't negotiate rates of pay, everything else was on the table in terms of collective bargaining. And so there was a lot at issue. And there were a lot of marshals, involved in the Eastern District of New York and the Southern District. It was a big deal. And, this 22-year-old, I wouldn't do it. I mean, if I had been he, I would not have done it, but he did.
So how did the marshals react to you? You're a young woman, hadn't finished law school yet, and yet you were negotiating these contracts.
Well, they pushed me around a little bit in the beginning, but they realized that I didn't want to push. And I've always liked men. I've always gotten along with them fine. So I think they just sort of saw I was, wasn't really that different.
Now, at the end of your law school career, did you have any particular professors who pushed you to go into any areas, or do you think that you were more influenced by the jobs that you were given in the Justice Department?
Well, I actually had an opportunity to also, I worked in my third year in law school with a private firm. I decided to try that, and it was interesting, but it wasn't where I wanted to go. And so then in my last year of law school, one of my professors tried to talk me into being a law clerk. He said, you should apply to be a law clerk. And I thought, oh my gosh, another year of school-like environment? No way. I said, that's not going to happen. I want to go to court. I want to be in the courtroom and be a lawyer, a real lawyer, not just a books lawyer. Biggest mistake I ever made, by the way, in terms of my law career, you learn so much as a law clerk. Perspective, close relationship with the judge, biggest mistake I made. But in any event, I was not about to sit with the books for another year. So he said, well, then you probably should be a prosecutor. He said, the professor, he was Nicholas Nunzio, and he was a judge on the DC Superior Court. And he said, so you should go and be a prosecutor probably. It's hard to get into the U.S. Attorney's Office right away, so I would recommend, he said, to go see the local prosecutors in Virginia where you live. So that's what I did.
And what happened after that?
Well, I went to see Bob Harand, who was the Commonwealth's attorney of Fairfax County, and he was the Commonwealth's attorney, probably for 30-some years, but at that time had only been for maybe 7 or 8. But he was still pretty well in place. And he was trying a case involving a murder that took place at the Madeira School, and it was a very, very high-profile case in the Washington area. And he didn't have time to talk with me. And so I had brought a book, actually on Thomas Jefferson. And so I said to the assistant who was out in the waiting room, I said, well, that's okay, I'll just sit and read my book until he has time. Well, when I think about it, that was pretty nervy. But I sat there and read for about 4 hours. And she said, Mr. Horan's not going to be able to see you. And I said, well, that's okay, I'll come back tomorrow. Maybe he'll have some time tomorrow. And he was still getting ready for this trial. And so then his assistant, who is now a very dear friend of mine, and I just had lunch with her a few days ago, after about 3 hours, I was getting on her nerves. And I was just sitting there. It was Fawn Brodie, I think. I was reading Thomas Jefferson, which was the big book then, 1974. And she went back, as I later learned, and said, this woman's nuts. You better talk to her or she's never going to leave. Just talk to her for 10 minutes. So he talked to me, and he agreed to hire me. And they hadn't had a woman prosecutor before, so I think he was he didn't hire me on the spot. He had me talk to his chief deputy, and I think they did a little behind the scenes talk, about whether they wanted to hire a woman, and that kind of thing. But they hired me.
What were your experiences like? Because being the first woman means that you're going into a man's world, and there are expectations that they have for the prosecutor that they're going to see. So what were your experiences like?
Really very good, with some amazing few very bad, okay? Almost all very good. The judges were fabulous. They just welcomed me. And I was an oddity, there just hadn't been any women prosecutors, and there really weren't very many women trial lawyers. Maybe 2 in Fairfax County. One of them did only domestic work. There just weren't women lawyers around then. And it's hard to believe now, but the judges were great. I mean, they were just so welcoming, and one judge, Arthur Sinclair, who was the chief judge of the Fairfax Circuit Court, he had 2 daughters my age, and I think that made a difference maybe for him. But every single one of the judges was great. Never treated me any differently. Actually, one of them did, but most of them were fabulous. And most of the lawyers I dealt with were, I was a little bit of an oddity, but once they realized I was there to stay, and the police officers too, I was kind of different, but they knew I was there to stay, so that wasn't going to change. And one of the police officers took me under his wing. In fact, I just talked with him yesterday. This was, we're talking almost 40 years ago, and he was one of Fairfax's big homicide detectives. And actually, he hadn't become a big homicide detective then. He was working robberies then. And he asked Bob Horan if I could go with him on what he called ride-along to interview witnesses. He said, I need a woman to talk to some of these women, particularly in these communities where nobody trusted the police. And he said, I come in there with my badge, and I'm this white guy, and nobody wants to talk to me. He said, Bob, maybe they'll talk to Barbara. Can she come with me? And he said, fine. And that was a very big experience for me because I got to talk to people who were victims of crimes, people whose children were victims of crimes, people who were afraid of the law, had no confidence that the law would ever vindicate them. I had to encourage them that they could come to court, that they wouldn't be threatened or hurt if they did testify. And it was a very important part of my training as a lawyer and my belief in the justice system, convincing these people who had no faith in the justice system that they could trust it. So that was very important.
Do you think that their experiences that it vindicated your advocacy of convincing them that they could trust the justice system? Because there's so many people who go in trusting the justice system, but find that there's inequality in the way that justice is meted out. And so did you see any situations during that experience where you saw that they did not get what you were hoping they would get?
Not usually, because the courts were very strict for violent crimes. If somebody was convicted of a violent crime, the juries gave very big sentences. So it was mainly dealing with the witness's fear, coming to court, getting through the process, fear of retribution in the community from the defendant's relatives, that kind of thing. They went away for a lot of years, most of those times, just because the juries were very conservative. And in those days, you know, the juries were both jurors were both black and white, although predominantly white. But Bob Moran was very adamant about that. He said, you know, you're colorblind when you're picking people, and don't ever make that, you know, a basis for your picking a juror. And he had a wonderful fundamental sense of fairness, and very talented person. And you know, he said to me when he hired me, he said, you know, he called me Milano. He said, Milano, I'm giving you a lot of responsibility. He said, you know, and if you do well, he said, you know, essentially, I don't know if he said the glory, but essentially the glory's all yours. He said, but if you screw up, he said, it's on me. He said, so don't forget that. He said, if you screw up, I've got to answer to you, I mean, for you, to the people. He said, and I don't want to have to answer to you, to the people, for you. And, you know, but he was good. I mean, he was a wonderful mentor and wonderful role model.
So you worked in that office for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And what made you decide to leave?
Well, back in those days, you were expected to leave. I mean, a few people stayed longer, but you didn't have career assistant prosecutors. You were expected to fly up, you know, and leave the nest and start your own practice. And so almost everybody left in 2 or 3 years. Maybe 1 or 2 people in those days stayed. But most of the young lawyers wanted to get out and have their own firms. And so, you know, none of us ever thought about joining a law firm. We all formed firms, you know, with former prosecutors, and that's what I did.
And so who was the other person that you formed a...
Well, there were 2 others, Dave Orenbeck and Larry Keenan, who I later married. And
tell me about that experience.
Well, it was, which, getting married or the...
Well, both. First, okay. Forming the law firm.
Forming the law. That was fun. Larry and Dave left before I did because they'd been in the prosecutor's office longer. So they rented the space, and, you know, I knew I was coming over to join them. So that wasn't, I didn't have to plan that. But when I left to become a lawyer, left the Commonwealth's attorney's office, I had one prospective client who was going to pay me $75, and that's it. I mean, you know, when I think about it, we just did it. And the judges were good to us. The judges sent us a lot of cases. Judge Sinclair appointed me to be a commissioner in Chancery and, you know, to hear divorce cases. So, I mean, heck, I was 26 then. But, you know, it was a great deal of responsibility for a young person. Made recommendations to the circuit court on the divorce cases that I heard. So, and then we got a lot of clients. My sister was a teacher even then, and so she sent us her fellow teachers, you know, do their real estate settlements, write their wills, do their speeding tickets. So we had a mom and pop business, nothing fancy. You know, we did some personal injury. We represented a Montessori school. Just basically people we knew in the community were our clients. But nothing fancy, no big firm. You know, I did not have that experience at all.
Did you get antsy after a while?
Well, yeah. I mean, I loved it, but, you know, I had this thought, I guess my dad had when he was in the sheriff's office back in Morgantown. I thought, you know, I could be doing this, you know, trying to get, you know, drunk drivers off for the rest of my life, or or, you know, and it always fascinated me in the courtroom, the role of the judge, the importance of the judge, and I decided I wanted to be a judge.
Do you know what really triggered that for you?
Well, no, it was something that just sort of developed during the almost 6 years that I was a lawyer. And then there was an opening, and you know, I went to talk to Bob Horan, and he said, "I'll do anything I can to help you." And he was a very influential person, you know, with the General Assembly. They respected him a lot. And I had to go for my interview with the Virginia delegation and from Northern Virginia, and they recommended me. Well, the Fairfax Bar recommended me first, and then the Northern Virginia delegation. And I went down to here in Richmond. I shouldn't say down, but I came to Richmond. And I remember some of the members of the House Courts of Justice Committee were totally befuddled because there was this 29-year-old in front of them wanting to be a judge. And in fact, he said, he finished my hearing by saying, well, if Northern Virginia wants, and of course Northern Virginia was even more the, you know, the outcast part of the state than it is now. If Northern Virginia wants to have a 29-year-old woman for a judge, I guess we should let them have at it. And so they passed on me and voted me. And I was a general district judge for a couple of years.
Now, the people who approved this, did any of them have in their collective memory that there had been at least one other woman who had served as a judge in that particular court system?
Well, not in the General District Court. I don't think they were pretty sure there had never been a woman in Virginia in the General District. At that time, there were 2 women that I know of who had been juvenile judges, and one was then currently. There was Susan Bundy, who was a judge in Lebanon, Virginia, Southwest Virginia. She was a juvenile court judge. And then Irene Pancoast had been a juvenile court judge in the city of Alexandria. But I don't think there had ever been at least that's what they told me. And we never found evidence of another woman, you know, having served anywhere in the state.
So let me ask you, what made you want to become a judge? There had really been no role models around you. And so what was that trigger?
Well, I loved some of the judges I appeared in front of. They were so fair and so caring and so smart. And Judge Lewis Hall Griffith, who later went on to the circuit court, started his first day on the General District Court, my first day as a prosecutor. And so we kind of moved along together. And he was fabulous. I mean, he was a caring person, he was thoughtful, he was smart, he was a listener. And you know, I just saw that judges were professional listeners, and they could do so much. And I just wanted to do it. I saw Judge Lewis Hall Griffith, I saw Judge Arthur Sinclair, whom I previously mentioned, Judge James Keith, just wonderful. Judge William Plummer, fabulous. I mean, these were judges who all took me aside and helped me as a young lawyer, gave me encouragement. And, like Lewis Hall Griffith, after my first jury trial, he said to me, he said, you know, you give a great closing argument. He said, you know, that is just one of your strongest points. And I should have known there was going to be the but. He said, you know, though, you don't need to tell the jury these things more than once. He said, if you want to emphasize something, you say it maybe twice. And I got the feeling, oh, geez, have I been saying these things 3 times to the jury? But, you know, but he did it so nicely. He made me feel like I was great. You know what I'm saying? But he was teaching me how to be better when I really wasn't great. I was just a beginner. And so I had these wonderful people I worked with, and I saw them as people I wanted to emulate.
And so you've gotten through your first year of being a judge. You got through your second year.
Mm-hmm.
Did you start feeling that there should be more because you're talking about at the lower court level, where you're hearing sometimes some very minor cases, sometimes some very major cases. So what was your perspective after a while with?
Well, and there were no jury trials in the General District Court. I was already jumping ahead to the circuit court, and I apologize on that. But, well, I really liked the district court a lot. I mean, there were sheer numbers. The volume was overwhelming, you know, there is no way to overstate the difficulty of listening to 300 people in a day talk about their traffic citation. And the challenge of listening to them and having them walk away feeling like they've been heard, that maybe you didn't agree with them, but you told them why, you listened, and you tried to make them have confidence that when they walked away that the courts worked. That's a huge job. And the judges who do that job, I mean, they deserve so much credit. They really do.
Why was that so important to you to make sure that you let every person coming through your court know these things?
Well, I mean, I came from a family of non-lawyers, as lawyers like to call us in the rest of the world. We were non-lawyers. We were scared of the law. I mean, you never wanted to talk to a lawyer. You didn't want to have any business with a court. I mean, that was bad news. You know, you went to see a lawyer when you bought your house, and, you know, that was it. I mean, stay away from the law. And so, you know, people even in my family, of very educated parents, they were afraid of the law. I got a witness summons once, and, you know, the sheriff came and said, "I'm here for Barbara Milano." Well, you know, big deal. But he made it seem like he was here to take me away. And my mother and grandmother got all nervous, and it struck me, and I thought, you know, all the guy had to say was, you know, "I've got a witness summons for your daughter. She witnessed an accident." But instead he, you know, came in with the badge of authority and, you know, big cheese. And I remember thinking, you know, people shouldn't be afraid of the law. So that sort of, I sort of carried that with me. But just also that, you know, but for the grace of God, I could be every one of these people, you know. I'm not a good driver. You know, or you know, I could have become a shoplifter, you know, as a teenager. Instead of, you know, ranting and raving about the Pope, maybe I would have stolen a magazine. You know what I'm saying? People make bad choices in life, but that doesn't make them bad people. And, you know, sometimes people become bad people when they make so many bad choices, but not the people I saw in General District Court. You know, they were just people who made bad choices. And so I wanted to get them through and do the best I could.
So tell us how long you were there and what happened next.
Well, I was there for 2 years, and then there was an opening on the circuit court because Judge James Kacharis was going to the federal district court. And so I thought, well, you know, maybe I should apply. And it was a very hard decision about whether it was the right time to apply. I was going through divorce. My husband Larry Keenan and I had been married. He had some substance abuse problems. It was impossible to deal with at that time, and we were getting a divorce. You know, we always remained friendly, and I was very proud of him until he died in 1999. He came back from his problems and made a life for himself again. But at that time, it was a very tough time, and the president of the Fairfax Bar paid me a visit in my office, and he said, "Barbara, you've got a great future. Don't apply now when you're going through this divorce." And I went home and I talked to my dad, and I said, "Dad, what do you think?" And my dad said, "Bull blank." He said, "You make a decision based on what's right for you." He said, "You're who you are. You have nothing to be ashamed of." He said, "Just because, you know, your husband had problems," he said, "you're who you are and you stand on your record." So I went back and I talked to the president, who was very well-intentioned, and I remember saying, "I'm going for it." And so I did, and the bar committee voted me out and recommended me, and they recommended 4 people. And then it turned out, fortunately, there were going to be 2 other new judgeships. So I was selected for the Judge Kacharis opening, and then Quinlan Hancock and Joanna Fitzpatrick were selected for the other 2 openings. So we actually had 2 women starting. I started just a few months ahead of Joanna, but we were the first women in Virginia in the circuit court.
And so your experiences, once again, as a pioneer, did it in any way impact you that you were being a pioneer?
Not really, no. There were certain things that struck me, you know, about just the whole process. You know, I mean, I had some, you know, people say some things that weren't very nice about, you know, about women, you know, making comments about, you know, lawyers just offhand in a joking manner. And they didn't mean anything, I guess. I just wrote it off to them, you know, not being socially, you know, very adept. But I know Joanna had some of that too. But when I went down to the legislature, you know, to get the job, the Northern Virginia delegation had selected me. And Senator Dick Saslaw was just a young senator then. And he stood up for me, and Bob Horan stood up for me, and it's because of the 2 of them that I became a circuit judge. It's because of the 2 of them I ever became a judge. And, you know, Dick believed in me. And the other, you know, the other people, the other members of the delegation were, you know, very involved. They were interested in how people thought about issues. And, you know, we had Senator Joe Gartland back in those days, Senator Clive DeVal. There were some really big names in the Virginia General Assembly in terms of contributors to the public welfare in the Commonwealth. And Northern Virginia was kind of a pariah. And I guess they again thought, well, if Northern Virginia's getting a little weird here again, you know, with these women, but let them do it. And so, but it was when I went to my first judges conference, I had an eye-opening experience because I sat and there were 2 African-American judges. And I don't know particularly why, but I decided I would sit next to them. So I went and said hi and introduced myself, sat next to them. And then at the lunch break, one of the other judges from Richmond came up to me at the break. By other, I mean white. Came up to me and he said, you know, you could get off to a good start or you could get off to a bad start. And I said, what do you mean? He said, is there a reason why you're sitting with them? I said, they look like nice guys and I just decided to sit with them. And he said, well, something to the effect, you're judged by the company you keep. And so I went back and sat with them and, you know, and steered clear of him. But most of the judges weren't like that. I mean, they really were, I think, very welcoming to both the African-American judges and to me. At least I can only speak for myself. The African-American judges would have to speak for themselves. But most of them, you know, were very welcoming.
Did you find that there were times when perhaps some people characterized the way that you would make decisions from a gender perspective, or were you free of any of those kinds of comments?
You know, I didn't feel like there was that much of that. You know, maybe I didn't hear it. I mean, I heard one lawyer say one very ugly thing about me. And when he disagreed, and he didn't know I was hearing it. And this was out in the hall, and he didn't know I was hearing it. And I don't know if I can say this for the cameras, but I probably should. He said, well, what do you expect from somebody who bleeds once a month? You know, so there's no question that some people had biases. But, you know, I didn't feel that in the main. People were good. I mean, they were encouraging, they were supportive.
Now, was he making this in reference to a decision that you made?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And what kind of, do you remember the decision that you made?
No, I don't. No, but I remember what was said. And so when we had a mutual friend, and so whenever I would see our mutual friend, I would say, "Is blank dead yet?" Because he was a lot older. I'd say, "Has he died?" And he'd say, "No." And he knew why I asked him that. He said, "No, he hasn't died yet." I said, "Let me know when he does." But, so, you know, I tried to kind of make light of it. But yeah, obviously it stuck with me. Right. But most people, by and large, were great. They really were.
Now, your experiences then on the circuit court lasted how long?
3 years. And I loved it. And that was the hardest job I've ever had.
Explain why.
My current job's pretty hard too. But it was so hard because you heard everything. A general jurisdiction court hears every possible kind of case, whether it's a common law case, a statutory case, a constitutional issue. It is unlimited what you hear. And you're expected to know things, and frequently you don't know them. And you had to show an extreme amount of humility on the job. I learned very early that the best way to be a good judge was not to act like you knew it, but was to say, you know, counsel, you're going to have to educate me on this one. You know, slow down, back up, and start over. Explain this. I'm not familiar with this. And you learned a lot when you listened that way. But
is this something that you came up with on your own, or did you?
No, I saw the good judges do. From my perspective, the good judges did that. They were the ones, the worst judges were the ones that tried to fake it and act like they knew it, and oh, they were bored by it, and oh yeah, I've read that case, you know, and it doesn't apply, you know. In fact, we once had a bar skit about one of the judges who used to always say, "I've read the case and doesn't apply," and I was the lawyer in the skit citing a case that didn't exist. And he'd say, "I've read that, Miss Milano, and it doesn't apply." So, you know, there were definitely a few judges who did that. But most of them were really good and would say, you know, you need to help me with this. I haven't had a condemnation case in so many years. You've got to, you know. And so seeing from the role models how to do it, as I saw it, the right way, I tried to do it the right way. But it was very daunting. You know, and lawyers had been working with their cases for sometimes years. They knew their cases inside and out. And in those days, we got the case. The clerk's cart would come around at 9:15 or 9:20 and dump off your case. And you went into the box with the jury at 10 o'clock. And no matter how complicated it was, it could be, you know, a murder case. And the clerk would dump the file on you at 9:20. And so you really had to learn on the fly, and you had to listen extremely well, and then you had to render as careful a decision as you could, not just a final decision, you know, when you were in a bench trial, but all these evidentiary rulings, you know, and they went fast, and expert witnesses, and there was so much of a, you know, complex and technical nature going on, and you just did the best you could. That is a hard job. Those judges are true heroes of the judicial system, along with the juvenile and domestic relations judges.
Do you remember if any of your decisions ever got reversed?
Yes, I do. A few of them were. I don't know if it was 3 or 2. I know one of them was involving the Fairfax City treasurer. It was a very highly politically charged case. And that was the only time I've ever been reversed, either as an appellate judge or a trial judge, that I felt it was done unfairly. Every other time, I goofed. And I deserved it. That one I felt was unfair.
Explain.
Well, you know, sort of spilled milk, you know, but I felt like when the opinion was written, I felt that it wasn't accurately quoting. It was characterizing what I said and not quoting what I said. and it was an issue of discovery and timeliness of discovery. And I said that the defendant hadn't demonstrated materiality. I didn't say the defendant hadn't, that they weren't material. And the opinion came out saying that I had ruled they weren't material. Well, of course they were material. They were the bank records, and she was charged with embezzlement, you know. But I said she hadn't demonstrated the manner in which they were material to the charges against her. And so I felt that was unfair. But other than that, I think the appellate courts have always called it right, and you know, I made mistakes just like anybody else.
Now, of course, your career took another trajectory a little bit after that, and I want you to talk a little bit more about that, about how you never got bored, it seems, with the kinds of challenges that you were faced with. And the state was moving in a very different direction. And there had been a push for a long time to create an appeals court. So tell us a little bit about, I know you were kind of on the outside looking in, but tell us a little bit about what happened in your career.
At the end of my circuit court time?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Virginia was going through a time where the big discussion was, should Virginia have an intermediate court of appeals? Virginia was the largest state at the time that did not have an intermediate level of review. It was simply go from the circuit courts, the trial courts, up to the Supreme Court. And because there wasn't an intermediate level of appeal, the Supreme Court wasn't able to hear nearly as many cases as should have been heard. And the Supreme Court knew that. And so Chief Justice Turco had very actively argued for an intermediate appellate court. And it finally was passed in 1984, I believe, and then we actually started business in 1985. But and then in the circuit court, my issue was, well, do I stay in the circuit court, or am I interested in being an appellate judge? And I really didn't know. But I did know that I didn't want to do it if the judges I respected most were interested. I wasn't going to put my name in. So I went to see them. I went to see Judge Griffith. I went to see Judge Plummer, and I think they were the only two I thought would be, could be interested. And they both said no, they weren't interested. And so I decided, that I was interested. And
Why were you interested?
It was different. It was exciting. Same old answers, I'm afraid. It was a challenge. I knew that when I was in the circuit court deciding cases, some of the most challenging work that I did was writing to explain decisions, and I knew it was going to be a career of writing decisions. That intimidated me, but I also thought, well, if I can do it, maybe I should do it. It's just another kind of another mountain out there, I guess, something that it seemed exciting. And it was also very exciting to me as a lawyer, because having been a lawyer representing criminal defendants, Supreme Court never heard your case. They couldn't. They would hear a petition because you had a right to petition, but they almost never heard a criminal case on appeal. They couldn't, just because they had so much stuff to do. They heard a few, but so the thought of being able to open up the appellate system to people who really thought they didn't get a fair shake at trial, that was pretty interesting and pretty exciting.
And so what happened after you went to, after you put your name in the coffer, so to speak?
Well, I was the candidate from the 8th Congressional District. What they did was the legislators decided they were going to be entering into this enormous food fight over who was going to be a judge. A single judicial vacancy, causes people to, bear arms in the General Assembly. And so the thought of deciding how 10 people would be selected was just, impossible. But somebody got the idea, and I don't know who it was, but they really deserve a medal for it. The idea, well, Virginia has 10 congressional districts, and the new Court of Appeals is going to have 10 judges. Why don't we just say there's going to be a judge from each congressional district, and let that district decide how they pick their judge and who the person's going to be. And unless they have four heads, you know, the rest of the General Assembly will go along with it. And so essentially, that's what happened. The Northern Virginia people picked me and Judge Charles Duff. And he was from Arlington, so he was the 10th district. And so we were the 8th and 10th. And so they pretty much went along with us, the rest of the state, because they wanted Northern Virginia to go along with their candidates. And so it was the beginning of a really very, very enjoyable time working with people from all over the state.
Now, you've talked before about your experiences on that court and how you all really had to frame the operation of the court, and you had a chance to kind of put your stamp on the evolution of the appeals court. And I was just wondering if you could actually kind of put into some kind of summary what your experiences were really like on that court, whether it was emphasizing perhaps the challenges, emphasizing the conviviality among those of you who were serving, or just something else. But if you could summarize that experience, and then we're going to look at some specific aspects of it. I was wondering if you could do that.
Okay, well, it was both personal and professional in terms of the experience. The professional, we were really very much aware that we were a court created to deal with the unwanted stepchildren of the Virginia Supreme Court. So those were the criminal cases, they were the domestic relations cases, certain administrative agency cases, and workers' compensation. These were all the cases that everybody knew the Virginia Supreme Court wasn't terribly interested in. And so it was a wonderful opportunity for us to really develop these areas of the law that in many respects had not been developed. And when you think of the explosion of cases in the U.S. Supreme Court during, you know, the Warren era, and, you know, then into the, through the 70s and into the 80s, I mean, there's a phenomenal explosion of constitutional cases that we hadn't had the issues dealt with in Virginia. And in domestic relations, very few domestic cases. Equitable distribution had just become the law of Virginia, I think maybe 82. So it was a brand new law to define domestic relations law in the future. There were lots of issues in the domestic field regarding foreign custody, parents from different countries, things that just didn't come to the Supreme Court of Virginia, but an appellate court could deal with. There were administrative cases involving certificates of need for hospitals, things that might be tedious and dull in the sense of reading the record, but so vitally important to a community. In terms of workers' compensation, injured people. I mean, these were really important areas of the law, and they were very people-oriented areas of the law, and that's what hooked me. I mean, once I started doing the job, I mean, we were affecting real people every day in such a broad way, not just the people in front of us, but so many other people who were affected by our decisions, and that was the challenge, and really the real great joy of it, feeling that it made a difference.
Now, initially you had a very heavy caseload because this was a new court, and you all were trying to work out the details of how you operate. What impact did that have on your personal life?
Well, not really. I mean, we knew we were all in there to work hard, and we knew the court had to be a success. I mean, there was no way you could start a court and have it not be successful. So whatever it took, we were going to do it. And Judge Kuntz was our first longtime chief judge. We had Judge Ballard Baker had been our chief judge for just a couple months, and then very unfortunately had a heart attack and passed away. So Judge Kuntz was really for all practical purposes, the architect of the court, you know, the leader of the building process of the court. And he was an absolute, it sounds like an oxymoron to say stickler for congeniality, but he was. I mean, he always emphasized the interpersonal relationships and how important it was to think of the other person in working in these 3-judge panels. You know, he used to say, now, you'll be wanting to write your own opinion, but you'll get somebody else's work to review. Review theirs first. Put yours aside. Think of them. He was always very, very good about that. And, you know, we always teased him that he was so touchy-feely because he had been a juvenile court judge for 9 years. And we just said, oh, Lawrence, you're just way too touchy-feely. But it was very, very good for us. And but we had fun too. I mean, we were all very passionate about the law. We were in a younger group and an older group. I was the youngest, and when we started, I was almost 35. I was still 34, but not by much. And then the younger group, I would say, went up to about age 48. And then there was a distinctly older group that was kind of 60 plus. And the younger group, I guess there were 6 of us. And so we were the majority of the court. And we had a lot of fun. I mean, we worked hard, and then we played tennis afterward, and we, ate too many donuts in the morning together and talked about how fat we were getting. And I mean, we just lived life together. We got to know each other's families. We were really a very cohesive group, and they're still my dearest friends.
So, of course, Judge Kuntz was a consensus builder. Why do you think he believed that was so critical, this kind of relationship that you described with your colleagues? Why that was so critical to the success of that particular court?
Genius and insight, I think. Really. Because, I mean, he had been a circuit judge like all of us except for Jim Benton. Judge Benton had been a very distinguished litigator, done many civil rights cases and many other cases. And other than Jim, we all had been circuit court judges, and Lawrence included. So there really was no reason for him to have that insight, except he has a wonderful insight in people, motivating people, making them work, and he's just gifted. So he got it, and he knew what needed to be done.
So what was your takeaway from that experience? What is it that you gleaned, and how did that change the way that you would look at and try cases?
Well, it's really, I came to appreciate how difficult the job of being a trial judge is. You never realize how hard it is until the day you stop doing it. I mean, all that you have to learn, all that you have to know, the quick judgments you have to make. And then when you become an appellate judge and you start reading through a trial and you think, oh my goodness, I did this. And you immediately empathize with all the different things that go on in a courtroom that a judge has to deal with. And then in writing, it's the ultimate act of humility, because you learn to write and rewrite, because you're writing for so many different audiences. You're not just writing for the parties, and they're very, very important. Obviously, it's their case and their lives. But you're writing also for the law, the future of the law in the Commonwealth. You're writing for the bar to help educate them how to do things. You're writing for the trial bench. How do you do things? You're writing for the public to explain to them how the courts are operating and why. So you have these, 4 or 5 different audiences, and you're doing it in one opinion as a writer, and you may not even be a trained writer. I certainly wasn't. So it was an enormous challenge and a very serious responsibility, and I became very aware of that very quickly. And also aware of mistakes that you can make, saying too much, saying too little, all the different things that an appellate judge needs to think about when fashioning a decision.
How long did it take you before you became perhaps more comfortable writing for such a large constituency?
Oh, I imagine it was a few years. Although, you know, Justice Compton, and I'll get to talk about them, I know, in a little bit, but Justice Compton said to me, "You really aren't a good appellate judge until you've been doing it for 5 years." And I think there was a lot of merit to what he said, because it just takes so much discipline to turn yourself into a professional writer when you haven't been one. And you've been a professional listener, and now you're turning to be a writer. And they're entirely different disciplines. And so it takes a long time, and probably he was right, many years. And I'm still learning. I mean, you never stop.
Did the Court of Appeals have any interaction on a professional as well as personal level with the Supreme Court of Virginia?
Well, not the most positive, I have to say. Justice Kuntz, always the optimist, and he really was. I mean, gosh, he was great, and he is great. And I have to say, I'm very biased. He's a dear friend. But Justice Kuntz thought, well, we should meet with the Supreme Court because there are issues. We have different rules. They have different rules. The lawyers are getting a little confused, even though they need to go to the particular rules of the court to which they're appealing. He thought that we could maybe iron out some potential wrinkles. And we knew the Supreme Court, but the word on the street was, they weren't too impressed with us. We were upstarts and I guess maybe moving into part of the turf, I don't know what. But Chief Justice Turco, who's the nicest person was the nicest person in the world, and I loved him. But he was very formal. He said, "Judge Kuntz, you've called for this meeting. You have the floor." And, and we were thinking, oh, holy Toledo, why did we ask to be here? Because they were all looking at us. And to her credit, Justice Lacey went out of her way. Justice Lacey on the Virginia Supreme Court, she went out of her way to try to build a bridge. And I love the others, come to know them and love them, but everybody else was just kind of sitting there. And so we felt it wasn't the most productive interaction, and we got the sense that, really we were a separate court, and they probably weren't, that interested in a working relationship. I found out over the years that that's very, very typical in other states, that what we were seeing unfold was something that is almost textbook similar to other states' experiences.
So why did Justice Lacey reach out and the others really didn't? And why is that kind of gap between the two courts so typical?
Well, first of all, for Liz, just because of the person she is, she's a nice person. She's a wonderful person. But I think it's also, if I might be biased enough to say, I think that it was part of her being a woman. And she was different from the day she arrived at that court because of her gender. And I think she had a sensitivity to people who were uncomfortable because she had been uncomfortable. And she probably didn't tell you that it was hard for her. I don't know the extent to which she did, but it was hard for her. And I think she reached out to us partly for that reason, but also just because she's a nice person.
And so why is there tension between the two courts?
Well, in our case, they had the 200-year albatross or benefit of history, depending on the way you look at it, on their side of the ledger, and we were brand new. And from their perspective, we probably didn't know squat. We just didn't know. And we were kind of interesting, probably like, species in the zoo, to look at. And I'm just teasing by saying that. But, there was no real affinity. They were doing different subjects than we were doing. They were much more formal than we were. They were very nice people, wonderful gentlemen. They really were. And as I said, I've come to know and love them over the years. But they were formal. And we're kind of these mostly young people who were kind of, I guess, rabble-rousers or whatever. So.
Did they loosen up a little bit after several years, or did this formality or this formal relationship continue?
Well, I think what happened was over the years we did more. And at some of the judges' conferences, we had appellate meetings, but that was initiated, I think really actually Lawrence was probably the one who pushed it when we got to the Supreme Court. He said, we need to have more of an integration with the Court of Appeals, and let's have speakers common to both of us. Let's have a writing professor come in. You know, everybody can learn from a writing professor no matter what kind of cases they do. Or let's have, you know, someone talk to us about, oh, I don't know, retirement benefits for judges, or, you know, something that we all have in common, irrespective of the subjects we deal with. And that helped a lot because we spent more time with them.
And so how long did you serve on the Court of Appeals?
It was 6 years.
And then what happened?
Okay, well then Justice Charles Russell announced his retirement, and his was the so-called Northern Virginia seat. Excuse me. And, you know, I had the same issue come up. I loved where I was. You know, Justice Lacey had already been on the Supreme Court at that point in time for 2 years. So it wasn't the first woman thing. You know, I had done the first woman thing in all the other judge jobs. And I don't mean to denigrate that. You know, it was a wonderful opportunity and a very big responsibility. But I really, the thing that made this very meaningful to me was I was going in front of the General Assembly, in my view, not because of my gender. I'm not for any reason because of my gender, but solely on my resume. And had a little bit of awakening when I got there. One of the members of the Courts of Justice Committee said, and he was 70-something at the time, and I don't want to be an ageist, but, you know, he was from Southern Virginia, and I guess reflecting more his background. He said, well, let me start, Judge, by asking you, why do we need another one of you? And I thought, I really didn't know what he was saying. I thought maybe he was saying Northern Virginia, Justice Russell's from Northern Virginia, why do we need someone else, you know, someone coming, you know, why do we need to fill that seat? I didn't know. And then the light went on. I thought, oh my gosh, he's asking me, why do we need another woman? He's still, you know. And I thought, okay, what am I ever going to say to satisfy this guy? You know, and of course these things go through your mind in nanoseconds. And I thought, nothing I say will satisfy him. So I said, well, Delegate Marks, if you, you know, if you like the work I've done, you know, I encourage you to support me. I said, irrespective of the fact I'm wearing a dress in front of you today. I said, if you have a problem with my work, I expect you not to support me. And I can live with either result. And he didn't ask me anything else. So, but that was the only obviously gender-related comment.
Did he ever say anything after that to you?
No. Nope. That was the only time I ever spoke to him in my life.
Well, obviously, you must have answered his question. And so you were confirmed to be on the Supreme Court of Virginia. And tell me if you can remember your first week, what was that like for you?
Well, I was 41 then. I thought I was old. Oh man, I didn't have a clue, but I thought 41 was really old. And I had gone to, you know, to the judges' conference room, and in the Court of Appeals, we always brought candy into the conference room. So I brought some Jelly Bellies the first day, and I put them down on the table for everybody, and Justice Compton looked at Justice Turco and said, Harry, who brought the food into this room? He said, I thought we all had an understanding there was never to be food in this room. I thought, oh boy, I blew it. And so Turco was as nice as, I started, you know, saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I brought the jelly beans. And Turco stood up and he said, they look mighty good. And he came over and took a handful, and that was really very much appreciated. So that was kind of my first experience with the brethren. But you know, they were great. They really were. They were so talented. I learned so much from each of them.
Give me some examples of what you learned.
Okay. I learned from Chief Justice Turco the importance of the institution and the history of an institution and the history of cases and how cases develop over the years and how doing something in one case might affect another case and how careful you have to be about institutional integrity and dignity in terms of the decisions. From Justice Compton, and I'm going down the level of seniority when I joined the court, from Justice Compton, I learned just the importance of crystallizing your analysis. He had the ability, better than anybody I've ever worked with, to just crystallize, to distill would be a better word, to distill to the absolute bare essentials what was going on in a case and why we were going to do something. He really did a good job in that. Justice Stevenson was just a fabulous role model. He believed the cases should go to trial. They shouldn't be thrown out ahead of time because the judge knew they were losers or suspected they were losers. He was a big proponent of the jury system and letting cases follow their natural course of events. And I learned the importance of that from him. I mean, I always believed it, but he reinforced that. Justice Henry Whiting, who also became my very dear friend, he taught me the importance of curiosity, the fact that there's so much more to a case than just what's in front of you. And just what's in front of you can be big or it can be little, but there's so much else going on in the case. And don't just focus on the big or the little crystallized or distilled issue. Realize everything else that's in there, the whole canvas. Don't lose sight of the canvas and be curious and interested and ask about the rest of the canvas. That was a real gift to me because I'm kind of a, linear thinker. And so that helped me a lot. And then Justice Lacey taught me the absolute value of detail. Oh my gosh. She could learn a record better than anybody on the planet. And the importance of detail because it really does matter. Sometimes you think you're dealing with broad legal issues, but what happened also is so important, and she knew that always. So I learned that from her. And Justice Sassell, later Chief Justice Sassell, taught me that sometimes it's important to rock the boat. Not everything's written in stone and shouldn't be. And he was always willing to look and reanalyze and rethink. And it's not that he advocated a lot of change, he didn't. He picked his spots, he was really a good strategist, but he showed that the importance sometimes of just saying, yes, we were wrong. Or saying, no, the world is different now. We need to do this differently. So those were the justices who were on the court when I joined the court. And then I've learned so much from the other justices. Oh my goodness. Justice Kinzer is so talented, now Chief Justice, our first woman Chief Justice. She's just great. And she's so smart. I mean, she's scary smart. And and just the others that I worked with. I mean, I loved working with Justice Goodwin and Justice Millett, although for a shorter period of time. Justice Kuntz is just one of my best friends in the world. So but working with him just felt such a dimension in my life. Lawrence was so interested in what is fair. And he realized that the law couldn't always do what was fair. But he never let you get away without asking the question, what's fair? He might have folded his tent and said, okay, we can't do what's fair, but he never let the books close on a case without thinking about it. He was really an invaluable contributor, and still is as a senior justice. All the others, I don't want to leave anybody out, by not mentioning them, but they just every single one of them I learned so much from.
Well, let me ask you. You were on the court when there was a change, also in who would be the Chief Justice, and you mentioned Chief Justice Leroy Hassell. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how he conducted the court versus Justice Carrico, Chief Justice Carrico, and not as a this one was better or you know, but rather talking a little bit more about him, especially since he was never interviewed before he passed away. So talk a little bit about his, in addition to what you've already said, his delivery, the way that he saw the law, but also his interactions with his colleagues.
Well, Leroy was special. And I might take people might take issue with me on this, but I think Leroy's greater contribution was being a justice than being a Chief Justice. And he was a fabulous Chief Justice. I don't mean to say he wasn't good, but Leroy and Liz really kind of led the new generation of the Supreme Court. You know, we had the older generation and then the younger generation. And when John Charles Thomas came on first, but then he left before I came. So when I came, the new generation was Liz and Leroy. And Liz and Leroy were very progressive thinkers in ways that the older generation sometimes was not. They were more risk takers. Leroy was very much willing to mix it up and stand on his views. And say some things just aren't right, and we can't go along with them. One case that I admired very much that he did before I joined the court was the dissent he wrote in Kelly versus First Virginia Bank, where the Supreme Court had issued what I thought was an incorrect opinion, saying that women who had been sexually harassed at work, their only recourse was to file workers' compensation. Well, workers' compensation, a definition of injury, is injury by accident, caused by a sudden structural or mechanical change in the body. Well, a fourth grader could tell you that not too many women were going to be able to show that because of being sexually harassed, they suffered a sudden structural or mechanical change in their body. And so what it meant was it was a graveyard. It was a graveyard for people who had a sexual harassment claim. And so Leroy, he just wrote very clearly that this is not right. This is not workers' compensation. This is something different. And so that struck me very, very strong. Leroy was very strong on, oh my goodness, in the home case, the case involving Nationwide Insurance and how it had marketed its insurance to blacks and whites differently in the city of Richmond. And the statistics were just overwhelming. This is when I was a member of the court, that Nationwide would avoid giving homeowners quotes to black homeowners. They would cite excuses of the age of the home or some other reason that they didn't cite. And the testers in these cases for and it was homeowners, I'm not sure what home was, but it was for racial equality and a private group. And they had testers who would go in, black and white, with their houses in black and white neighborhoods, and with virtually the same criteria other than the location of the house, they would be either accepted or rejected by Nationwide in many, many instances, simply because of where the neighborhood was located. And so there was a lawsuit where Judge Randall Johnson was the judge in another very good friend of mine and my husband's, was the judge in the lawsuit that Home brought against Nationwide. And actually Tim Kaine was the lawyer, Governor Kaine, now Senator Kaine. And the lawsuit, the jury found in favor of Home and assessed $100 million in punitive damages. The case came on to our court on appeal, And the issue was, well, could home, this private organization, could they show standing? Could they show that they would be suffering an injury if they couldn't bring their case in court? Did they even have a right to bring it in the first place? And we had said in some zoning cases in Virginia Beach in particular years before, that it wasn't just enough to care about the flowers in the sand and stuff like that. You had to have a real stake. You had to suffer an injury. You had to essentially live nearby or have some sort of real stake in order to be able to challenge an action. And so the question here was, could this anti-discrimination organization, what did they have to show? Could they show that they'd suffered an injury? It wasn't they who had been turned down for these homeowners' insurance policies. And so a majority of the court voted to overturn the circuit court verdict. And Justice Cassell wrote a dissent, and Justice Lacey and I joined it. And I would recommend that to any student of the law in Virginia. It is beautiful, it is eloquent, and it is devastating, absolutely devastating. Nobody could write a better opinion in terms of when he had something he was passionate about, I wouldn't want to be on the other side. I mean, it was beautiful. I think in large part as a result of his dissent, a member of the majority voted for a rehearing, and while the case was pending rehearing, the case settled. And home got a pretty big verdict. But Leroy, he was very passionate about cases involving people. And he once told me, he said, you know, I represented so many doctors when I was a lawyer in private practice who were involved in malpractice cases and probably got off when they shouldn't have gotten off. And he said, you know, I feel a little bit that I want to take an extra special look at some of those cases. So he really learned that field inside and out and wrote some very, very important cases in that field. I mean, he wrote a lot of important cases, and he was a very challenging colleague. I mean, he knew his stuff, and he knew it inside and out. And he was never ashamed of his positions. And he was a very, very talented and gifted person.
So how did he impact the way that you looked at the law?
Well, Leroy had, both Leroy and Lawrence affected me very much in terms of the Supreme Court of Virginia and maybe what the future looks like on the Supreme Court. Leroy more in the field of civil cases, you know, things that were, you know, maybe could change or not necessarily change, could evolve. And Lawrence in terms of criminal cases. Excuse me, again, in terms of fairness. Lawrence would say, you know, just there's some things that we need to think about. Some things that courts aren't forced to do, but should do. A good example is the case of Fishback versus Commonwealth. The Supreme Court of Virginia had already said, excuse me, the Supreme Court of the United States had already said in Simmons versus North Carolina that if a defendant is not eligible for parole in a capital case, the jury has to be told, because then they'll know that the defendant is going to be locked up for life. And we had Fishback come up, and that was a non-capital case. It was just a regular felony case. And there was no requirement in Virginia, and certainly no requirement in the Supreme Court law that made us do that, in constitutional law. But Lawrence, and the issue was, since parole had been abolished in Virginia, but so many people had a common perception that defendants got out on parole soon after they got in, isn't it really the right thing to do that the jury should be instructed that parole has been abolished in Virginia, except for geriatric parole and certain, you know, unusual aspects? And, you know, we had a knockdown, drag-out discussion over around the conference table, And Lawrence convinced everybody. And, at first I thought, I don't know about this. We've never done this. And Lawrence just wouldn't let go. He said, why wouldn't we? Why would we want juries to send people to the penitentiary under this misconception that is the law? I mean, if the law is contrary to the popular conception. And he kept at us, and we changed. I mean, and that's an example of Lawrence. With Leroy, there were a lot of different things that he encouraged the evolution of the law. When did an injury occur? Could a parent bring in a lawsuit on behalf of a fetus for an injury? All sorts of different things that we hadn't decided. And Leroy was very intellectually curious, and he was a very forward-thinking person in terms of the law. And so I really think of his best contributions, and I know probably 9 out of 10 lawyers would tell you differently, but I don't think they know how vital a role he played around the conference table in thinking through these cases. Everybody did. I mean, Liz, again, with her knowledge of detail, she was a really big presence too, because she would bring people up short. And Lawrence, with his emphasis on fairness, you know what I'm saying? Everybody did it. But Leroy should never be forgotten, just because he wasn't able to talk about it.
Now, you've talked about what others have brought to the court and to the table. What do you think you brought to the table that others may not have had or thought about, coming from your background, coming from your training, coming from your personality?
Okay, my first answer is you have to ask Lawrence about that when you interview him later on. I don't know. I certainly brought my love of the law, my sense of curiosity, wanting to do the right thing, wanting to see if there's a place for progression in the law rather than being totally static, the importance of the law evolving. I am not an originalist in any way, shape, or form of the word. I personally find that antediluvian in orientation. I think the beauty of our Constitution is how it evolves as our society evolves. So I hope I brought some of that, but I don't know. You really have to ask other people. But I sure liked everybody with whom I worked, and I'm sure I gained more from them than they gained from me.
Obviously, you've started a new chapter.
Mm-hmm.
You were nominated in 2009 by President Barack Obama to serve as a judge on the 4th U.S. Court of Appeals. And I was wondering what your thoughts were when you got word of that nomination.
Well, very mixed. Of course, I was very excited. I knew I wanted to do it. In fact, I went to see the elders, as I mentally think of them on the Supreme Court, my friends, and I wanted to explain to them why I was interested in the federal appointment, because I loved my job in Virginia so much. And I remember talking with Charlie Russell, Justice Russell, and I said, Charlie, I've been doing this for 18 years now, and at that time, I guess I was 59, and I said, Charlie, I could be doing this for, another 15 years. I love it, but there's this whole other world out there, and I want to try to do that. I don't want to hang it up before I can try to do that too. And he said, no, I understand, we'll miss you, but I understand. And, the federal courts play, such an important role in terms of protecting people's constitutional rights. The state courts certainly do too, but the federal courts are the last stop. And that's such a significant and awesome responsibility in the history of the federal judges in this country, like Judge Merritt and Judge Frank Johnson and people like that. I mean, they're just storybook histories of how they have used the federal courts to protect people. So I was certainly drawn by that. drawn by the important roles that the federal courts have played throughout our history. Again, I guess history coming back. And so, so when I received word of the appointment, I was very happy. I was very sad to leave my friends and to leave Virginia, because I love Virginia, and Virginia has become such a diverse and wonderful place. I mean, it's always been wonderful in many respects, but I think has just come to its full adulthood, robust adulthood in the last 30 years in terms of enjoying everybody, in terms of celebrating everybody's contributions. And so there was a lot of emotion involved. I mean, part of it was, I thought, well, if I stayed on the court, I might become Chief Justice. I might be interested in that. And I thought, I'm not really an administrator. I'm a judge. And not that Chief Judge, not to minimize that role at all. It is so hard, and you have to have vision. And I think Justice Kinzer has vision, Justice Assel did, Justice Turco. But that's not me. I'm a judge. And so I think that was sort of the fork in the road. It would have been hard for me to stay on the Supreme Court of Virginia just based on my DNA and have somebody junior to me become Chief Justice. I probably would have felt I should try it, and try to do my best. And so it was a choice of either that or continuing to be, I don't want to say just a judge, but continuing to be primarily a judge and doing it in a huge new world. And so that's why I picked it. And why they picked me, you'll have to ask them. But it's been very interesting. I miss my colleagues in Virginia. We had a very close-knit sense of family. I mean, it sounds hokey, but and Lawrence is a hokey, but it sounds schmaltzy. But to say we were like family, but we really were. And I still feel like I'm like family when I walk in the building and see people. I don't know if I'll ever have that sense in the new job. I love my new colleagues. I like every one of them personally. But you don't work in a court system for 30 years without just feeling really love for the institution, and not just for the judges. And I'm so remiss that I haven't said this earlier in the interview. The people who work to keep the courts going, they are fabulous and they are underpaid, and they are so dedicated and so selfless. I can't even begin to tell you, the clerks, the law clerks, everybody working so hard to make every level of the Virginia court system a good representation of justice in America. And really we're as good as we are because of our staff. And I should have been talking about them ages ago, and I apologize to them because they're what makes us work, and they're great.
Well, let me conclude, because I know that we've been at this interview for quite a while. Two last questions for you. The first one, looking back over the different caseloads that you've had over the years here in Virginia, which case has been perhaps the most challenging case, or the case that you wish may have gone differently?
Well, those are two different questions. The most challenging case, or at least I understand it as two different questions, the most challenging case that I had was the Gilmore versus Landseidel case, the case involving the legislature and the enrollment of a bill. And it was essentially a case where all the branches of government were involved. The Attorney General was suing the legislature on behalf of the governor. I mean, it was high-charged, political theater on their part. And on our part, we were a court doing our business. And it was very hard to do business as a court, but we did. And I'm very proud of what we did, but it was very technical and very hard. That was, you know, really the only time when my office worked through the night for several days. Most of the time, you know, we do our work at home. I work at home every night on the computer, you know, for a couple hours, but I don't make everybody in the office work. But, you know, the stakes were so high. We didn't have the benefits, you know, the wide types of computer research benefits then that we do now, 1997. You know, it was a lot different. And I only had one law clerk and one judicial assistant. I mean, it was amazing, the amount of work we put into it. But, so that was clearly, for me, the most challenging. One case that I've lived with that I've never felt really comfortable with, but I do believe it was the right thing to do, was when I never liked a death penalty case. I mean, quite flat out. It doesn't fit in our system of justice, killing people in the name of the law, in my view. I wouldn't have taken the job unless I thought that I, you know, could implement the law, and I certainly have. But I really do think it's a waste of resources, that the deterrent value is so low, that we really need to lock people up for life and truly leave them there. I mean, no chance of getting out. That's my personal view. But I really never, I mean, I signed off on many death penalty opinions because that was the law and it was fairly applied. And I signed up to do it, so I did it. But the one case that bothered me was a case involving a teenager who got the death penalty and was executed. And he committed a terrible crime. His name was Stephen Roach, and back in the 90s. And he essentially blew away with a shotgun an elderly neighbor who had bought him Christmas presents. You know, I mean, it was a horrible crime. But he had committed burglaries, but he hadn't committed another crime of true violence. And it was a very hard case. But I couldn't say that his sentence was disproportional to sentences of other people who had preyed on the elderly. I mean, what he did was just so terrible. The woman had taken him into her trust, into her home, and he blew her away for her Social Security check on the day he knew her check arrived. But I still felt badly about that case because, you know, killing a teenager in the name of the law it's a burden for anybody who does it. And none of us ever treated those cases lightly, and none of us ever treated them in any kind of fashion other than just being very, very careful that the law was followed.
I know that you have many more years on the bench, but where you are right now, what would you like for someone to write as your legacy of what you've accomplished so far, of the perspectives that you've had regarding the law? What would you like for someone to see as your legacy?
Well, it's so hard to speak about yourself because you're asking me to say something of a positive nature about myself that others may not share, so they'll have to say it for me. But I would hope that people would say I was a good judge and that I cared and that I worked very, very hard to do what I thought was right. And that's about it.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.